Okay, so we're going to do an axle shaft on this 2009 Subaru. Right now the steering wheel is locked. You don't want the steering wheel locked when you're doing an axle shaft because you want to be able to spin this back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and lower it down, put the key in, disconnect the battery, negative cable, and then I can maneuver this to get things out of the way as I take it apart. Alright, so now we can maneuver the tire depending on what we're trying to take apart. Got a lug nut left on the tire. Always with tires, forklift straight back. Okay, my arms are a forklift. I don't want to use my back whenever possible. Alright, so this is the axle nut right here. Okay, my students have taken this apart many times. So what they should have done when they finished the last axle shaft, they should have dented this nut, and that is the lock. There's no cotter pin. Sometimes there is a cotter pin, this one does not. So we're going to take that off. We're going to take the brakes off. We're going to take the ball joint off. We're going to take off the sway bar link, the tie rod, and then we're going to do the strut. And technically there is a flex line. They were missing the 10mm bolt here. So you got to unbolt the brake caliper flex line and hang that out of the way. So let's get started. Okay, so this is a 6-point axle shaft nut, so 32mm 6-point. Use an impact socket. A lot of the cars use 12-point axle nut sockets, so it'd be 32mm, or this is an 1.75 inch, and you can make this work. Although you would argue, or you could argue, this is not an impact socket, it's a chrome socket. They tend to crack. Safety tests tell you these are dangerous to use on impact guns. When you're working on your own, sometimes you got to go with what is available at the time. Okay, next up is the brakes. Alright, so I'm going to use my air ratchet. Make sure it's going counterclockwise. In my toolbox, these are high school students. It took a 14mm, but unfortunately they had two 13s and the 14mm was missing. This is where your mechanical sense will tell you, 9/16 and 14mm are almost identical. Okay, so I have no problem using a 9/16 to replace a 14mm. That. Now I'm going to take this caliper off. I'm going to take a bungee cord and I'm going to hang this out of the way. This will turn when I turn this. Okay. So now we got the mounting bracket to do. The bolts are already loose. My high school students didn't torque those. It was a real rush getting out of here when we went to COVID. So when we went to COVID, I just told the students, get it together. And they did. They got it together, but they didn't torque anything. We're doing a tie rod end now. All tie rod ends most of them have a cotter pin. They're not reusable, so I'm going to grab the cotter pin with the diagonal cutters. You grab it, and all diagonal cutters are meant for prying and for cutting. Okay, so you get an edge like this, and then you just pry it out. Okay, and we're going to throw that away. Now, as far as taking this tie rods off, my tool of choice is a 3/8 impact gun, and same with the ball joint. I love the 3/8 impact gun. It's my favorite tool to use for automotive. And we're going to go ahead and take that nut off. Let's see, looks like it's a 17mm. Alright, so I'm going to take an 18mm, put it on here, make sure you're going reverse. Okay, and we're taking off a castle nut. That's the first sign that there's a cotter pin. Alright, so tie rod ends. There's several ways to take these apart. I'm going to go over a few of them. Okay, the right tool for the job, if you were to watch a lot of videos, would be this tie rod tool. It's a press, It works really well. You just hit it in, and you tighten this nut, and then it will pop out. So it's actually a really good way to remove tie rods and also ball joints. You could just use a good old-fashioned hammer and a pickle fork. Okay, so a hammer and a pickle fork. Put this right here. You hit this. It does damage the boot for the grease, so it's not the best option if you're trying to save the tie rod. Okay. Another option is, if it's really stuck, specifically ball joints, is to use a pickle fork with an air hammer. So you could put this in here, and you can air hammer it and pop it free. My preferred choice, and you can see the students do this, is they hit it with a hammer. The problem is you tend to damage the the splash shield for the rotor if you have a poor aim. Okay? We'll go with the method that makes sense here because it is jammed in there pretty well. Put that tool on, run that down, and that's probably going to take a 3/4. This on here. Rolling. Okay, I got my tool in place. I'm going to make sure I'm going the right direction, and it doesn't take a lot of force. There we go. And there's our tie rod. Okay, so we have a sway bar coming in, and with a sway bar link attached to the lower control arm. Sometimes sway bar links attached to the strut. It just depends. Sometimes they attach in the middle of the lower control arm. We need to take this off, the sway bar link, so that way we could pull this lower control arm down. There you go. And then a good habit is to always screw these nuts back on so you don't lose them. They stay with the part you just took off. Okay. And we're ready to do our ball joint. We already removed the cotter pin. So we have two ways to do this. We could do the bolt of the castle nut on the control arm, or we could do the pinch bolt up here on the steering knuckle. Either way works good. I'm going to go with the castle nut. Okay. And now we should be able to pull this lower control arm down. I think we're going to have to use a little pickle fork action to get this to go. Put that underneath. There we go. Pull that out of the way. And the last step would be to take the axle shaft out. Okay. It is usually stuck inside the hub, so what we need to do is hit the end of this with a hammer. So I'm going to take my axle nut, I'm going to actually put this right back on here, and I'm going to hand start it all the way till it's flush. So the way you don't damage the nut is you make it flush with the axle shaft, and then you hit it with a hammer, and then you don't damage it. So use the air hammer, put it right in the middle of the axle shaft, and hit that through. But 90% of the time that shaft will be stuck in there. I can remove this now completely out. You do want to be cautious of your ABS sensor if it's equipped with one. I have enough play in here that I didn't have to remove this, but you don't want to overstretch that cable. And then I'm going to go back underneath inside here between the transaxle and the axle shaft CV joint, and I'm going to pry that out. And then with 2 hands, I'm going to pull this out, okay? And it'll come right out. Now, here's the thing. This CV joint won't come apart unless you air hammer to knock it off. This one right here allows for the suspension travel up and down, and you could actually pull this out. So if you were to pull this right here and it's still attached, you could actually separate the joint. So grab it here, and work it out without, and the biggest thing is, don't drag the threads on the seal, okay? Because that will cut the seal. That's another reason why you want to do this. There is a clip here, and it's really important we talk about this clip. This little clip goes inside the side gear, inside the differential, okay? So the reason why I use a pry bar and I have to pop it is we need to compress, it compresses this clip so you could pull the axle shaft out. If it's stuck in there, the trick is to turn your axle shaft a half a turn. Hopefully that clip will drop down into place so you could pop it out. So if you can't get this axle shaft to pop out of the transaxle, turn it. Turn it again. And hopefully you get this in the right position where when you use a pry bar, it pops right out. Alright, we're going to go ahead and put this axle shaft now back in. If you need to replace the axle seal, you would have done that already. The big trick is not to drag the axle shaft or the CV joint across that seal. Alright, now once you need to twist it a little bit so you can feel it click into those little gears. Now that little clip is not in there right now, so I need to come back to the end and I need to stab it. So I'm going to really jam it, and you hear it click, and you make sure it's completely flush, and it is. So we're good. I have that all the way in. You got to make it sure that you actually have a hitting action at the end to force that C-clip to compress and go inside the transaxle. I'm going to go ahead and take my axle shaft, stick it inside the hub, get that hub all lined, pull down my control arm, line that up, okay, take my tie rod, put that up, have my castle nut right here for the tie rod. A little hard to, there we go. Get my castle nut for my ball joint. This would be a time where you'd want to chase these threads. This one right now, we're right about on the verge of having to chase those threads, and we'll make a separate video on how to use a tap and die set. I want to get my sway bar link in. Okay, there we go. And now all my ports are started, and I just got to go ahead and tighten them all. The big thing with the castle nut is you have to line the hole up so then you can put the nut in there. So let's get started with that. Okay, so before you tighten it, make sure you know where the hole is. The hole kind of goes on the side over here, so come around this way and you'll see the hole. And so I need to make sure the castle nut lines up with that hole. So I'm going to run it down. Now our rule is in Miramar, torque it to spec. But the thing with a castle nut is not only do you torque it to spec, but you got to line that hole up. And I have it lined up right now for the cotter pin. Let's go ahead and tighten our tie rod in. The hole's going this way. So this one's going to be a little hard to see where the hole's at after I tighten it. Okay, let me look on this side. And I'm good with that. So I got it on the first try. I'm happy with that. Okay. All right, now we're ready for the sway bar link. Sometimes, instead of the ball joint, the easier choice is to take apart the steering knuckle from the strut, okay? But when you take apart the steering knuckle from the strut to remove this, then the steering knuckle is still attached to the control arm with the ball joint here. So keep in mind about that, and also it's a way where you could do it without removing the brakes, although I argue remove the brakes just makes things easier. But if it's going to be a real heavy truck steering knuckle, then maybe it's better to disconnect up here than down here. But usually trucks won't have the McPherson strut. There'll be a SLA suspension system. So, all right. So we're going to tighten the axle shaft nut up. But I'm only going to run it down and kind of hammer it to about 150 foot-pounds. It takes it over 300, or it might be 250 for Subaru, but I'm not going to run it down tight. Okay, that's all I'm going to do. When we get the tire on and get on the ground, we're going to torque it to spec, and then I'm going to hit the axle nut with a punch to lock it in place. Alright, I'll put my rotor on. I'm going to grab my mounting bracket here. I'm going to slide that on. And what's nice is you're grabbing the mounting bracket, but you're also grabbing all your bolts at the same time. Stick your head in here and just kind of line up the bolt holes. Okay, so we got to get these bolt holes lined up inside here. Okay, it's a little tricky sometimes. Good thing to do is just get underneath there and you can see what you're doing. I got the bottom one started, top one, 2 or 3 turns. Your air ratchet going the right way. Always understand with the air ratchet, it's going to kick. You got to be ready for that. Okay. Okay. Now we're ready to go ahead and put our brake pads in here. Make sure your anti-rattle clips are in. This one right here is your wear indicator. That always goes on the inner pad, okay, inside pad, and then the one without that clip goes on the outside. There we go. Undo your bungee cord that protected your flex line, and then it's a good idea if you want to be professional, clean and lubricate your slide pins. Okay, there we go. We're not doing that right now because the video is mainly about the axle shafts. Oh, the one thing I will say is your brake line. You don't want your brake line to be all twisted, okay? So look at the way the brake line is, and this is the way it's supposed to be. It goes through here, goes up and goes to here. But a lot of students twist and turn the brake line to where there's a high spot and you won't be able to get the air out of that line, okay? So always be aware of that with your brake line. When you're installing a caliper, you don't want to twist that. Okay, have another caliper bolt right here, not sliding pin. Everyone has an opinion on what to lubricate the slide pins with. The new silicones are really good for caliper sliding. Most brake pads come with them. Anti-seize is another thing, maybe even white lithium grease. I use white lithium grease a lot. But every mechanic has an opinion on that. So what you're comfortable with, or what the manufacturer says. Same with the bolt torque. The bolt torque, the proper way to torque bolts is with a torque wrench. I'm doing this for speed. You should look up the torque spec for the mounting bracket bolts, the caliper bolts, the ball joint, the tie rod, the sway bar link, and torque it to spec. That is the true manufacturer and professional standard. This is a video on just how to get the axle shaft out and put it back in properly. Okay. All right, so we're going to put the cotter pins in, slide it through the hole right here, have one inside the ball joint. Now we're going to take our wire cutters. Okay. Everyone has a different technique on how to do cotter pins. I like to fold one over the top, and then I like to cut the back side. Okay, that's my preferred method. Ball joint down here, again, I like to fold it over the top. If it's long, cut it. And then the other side, I just cut off flush. Okay, and that's how I do it. A lot of people like to go butterfly around it, and you know, it's preference. All right, so now we got our tires. We're gonna go ahead and hand start the lug nuts, 2 to 3 turns, so you don't damage the threads. Okay, so get those started 2 or 3 turns each time. Okay, we're going to use a torque stick that's rated at 80 foot-pounds, and then we're going to torque the tires to 85. Star pattern with this. Don't go hammer it until you run them all down snug. And once they're all snug, you hammer them. So this will get it to 80, and then a torque wrench is going to get to 85. Now we're going to lower it down. We're going to torque the axle nut, and then we're also going to torque the lug nuts. All right, we're on Pro Demand right now, so we want to look up our torque specs. So I'm going to do 2009 Subaru Legacy 2.5 boxer motor limited. Use this vehicle, and I'm going to put in half shaft. Take that. I like Pro Demand because when you type in a part, it gives you everything you need to know. Technical service bulletins, top problems and failures, top repairs, causing. I want to go to specifications because we need to know our torque specs. Okay, and so let's see here. So it's just talking about the diameter. Specific. So here we go. Axle specifications. Oh, it's actually a lot lower than I thought. Okay, so axle specification for the front is 162 foot-pounds. Okay, so that's good. And if you wanted to get the torque specs for all the other parts, you would have to search those individually. You're not going to find it in the axle shaft section. So it is possible on some repair manuals, if you go to the remove and replace procedure, which would be down here, they might give you it as you walk through the process. So remove an axle nut, there's the punch that they're talking about hitting. We're going to do that at the end. I did the castle nut. They're talking about doing the pinch nut on the ball joint. Okay, they're using actual a puller or press to pop that out. I showed you different ways to do 2 different ways to do that. And then this is now the removal of the rear. We're not doing the rear. And then you could take these apart and you could do the CV boot. So you could still buy CV boots if the CV boots are torn. The thing about doing CV boots is the axle shaft is so cheap now, you're just better off to replace the axle shaft. Okay, I will make it where there's extra credit for you to take apart an axle shaft in the class. So I will have that as an option for you on how to take apart an axle shaft and practice removing the boots, the CV boots. Okay. All right. So now the inspection on how to inspect it. And then now the assembly of the front one. So let's see if they have the torque specs, or this is the one for reassembling the axle shafts. Assembly of the rear axle shafts. We want to go installation. And now here we go. Installation of the front drive shaft. And I just want to see if there's a torque spec for this. So it gives you the axle nut. Temporary install it, which is where we're at right now. There is a special tool, it looks like, from Subaru to protect the axle shaft seal so you don't damage it when you install your axle shaft. I talked about that you do not want to drag it when you install in a transaxle. Connect the front arm ball joint to the housing. Oh, it does give you it. 36.9 foot-pounds for that. Stabilizer length, 33.2 foot-pounds. Now install the brake pedal, tighten the axle nut to a specified torque. So that's the 162 foot-pounds, and then we're done. Okay. All right, so I'm setting it to the foot-pound rating that was specified in the manual. I believe it was 162. So I'm going to go one full turn. The handle is 10, and then 2 more, 160. Okay. And if you take torquing, they will always tell you it's better to pull than to push. But 162 is a lot of torque. Okay, so that is torqued, and then the last thing I have left is to torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. We need to take a punch, and we need to dent this, and you know what? Why don't you hit stop? At 85 foot-pounds, I'm going to model what they're talking about with pulling. Okay, and pulling, you should pull 85 foot-pounds. You should go on a pattern, a star pattern with the lug nuts. Okay. You don't want to pull and go past the click and keep going, so just be aware of that. People that use torque wrench for the first time, they'll go past the click. The other thing is they'll scratch fenders because they don't make themselves aware of where the handle is.